into positions of hopelessness and helplessness. The government gives them the drugs, builds bigger prisons, passes a 3-strike law, and then wants us to sing God Bless America. No, no, no. Not God Bless America. God damn America. That's in the Bible for killing innocent people. God damn America for treating us citizens as less than human. God damn America as long as she tries to act like she is God and she is supreme.
Okay, what's up? Hello, happy 420, happy Easter. It's one of those years we're on the same day. He is Rizzler. How about that? Is there any meat on that bone? Hi, I'm Jake Flores. That's Anders Lee.
Anders Lee here.
Ooh.
I am coughing, not for the holiday reasons, but every time around this time of year, I usually get my voice sounds cool, and I kind of want to keep it this way, frankly. But this is not from smoke inhalation; it's just from allergies.
It's from allergies
or a cold. I don't know what it is exactly, but it's just a cool voice.
Oh, cool. I'm happy for you. I love when that happens because it makes your voice even more like this.
Yeah.
I think is a cool affect.
It's honestly from podcasting because I got this the other day when I recorded the interview that we were going to hear, and then I did another podcast, and then my voice was shot, even though it feels like you're talking at the same volume that you do in normal life. Just the act of doing it into a podcast like expends more energy in your larynx or something, and then your voice gets fried.
It's crazy how anything that is technically work makes you fucking tired, and it's like we're constantly kind of trying to like get around that. But if you have to drive a car for part of your job, you're like, it's a car. I press a pedal and then it goes forward. You ever done it? Fucking exhausted by the end of it. It doesn't make any sense. It's weird. This shit, you're like, I'm talking. I talk all day normally. But no, it's like you get up out of the chair, like fuck, it hurt to sit in the chair, kind of. It's like,
yeah,
kind of fucks your back up and stuff.
I love fucking around with conveyor belts at home, but then when at the factory, it's just not as fun.
I know, right? I don't know. I hit stuff with my hammer and do my the jungle ass movement. I move a can. I was watching Zizek talk about that the other day.
Oh, I saw this. What I think you're about to say, yeah.
There's two things he said. He was kind of on the same tip in both these clips, and I've been thinking about it a lot, just thinking about like factories and stuff, because all of that is in the air right now, with like bringing it home and all that shit and trade and stuff. But like, you know, he said this thing that I tend to agree with. Like, I think about it a lot. It's kind of why I retweeted it. Or he's just talking about how like back in the day you had these like inhumane, you know, factory jobs where your job was just to do one movement over and over and over. And it's like, we all understand that to be this like horror of capitalism. Marx wrote about it. Upton Sinclair wrote about it. A liberal today will tell you that like capitalism is now regulated. It's not that anymore. It's not mining, and it doesn't have, you know, children and stuff. And so that's the bad capitalism. But then he's talking about how it's like the new thing we have is kind of worse because you're like sort of asked to like perform and get all creative and stuff, but it's still alienated. So you have to like do all this creative stuff and use like all these faculties of your mind for like something that has nothing to do with you. And you know, so he's kind of making this argument of like somebody quote tweeted this and they were like, that's why I love my dishwashing job. And I was like, yeah, that's why I like jobs like that. That's why I was really looking for a dishwashing job like a year ago and I couldn't find one. I was like, no. I want to do that so that I can use my brain for other stuff because I have to divide up all that stuff. But then he takes it in another direction in another clip. And I really like this because it almost sounded like stand up to me or something. But he was talking about pornography and he was like, when you watch pornography, yeah, you know, the man is like, we always talk about the woman as being objectified, but the man is a real object because what he's doing is cold, sterile movement. You know, he's completely object, like just a physical thing, like a tool or something. You know, you're not really thinking of him in that way. But the woman, and obviously he's talking about like straight pornography or whatever. There's all sorts of ways to dissect this. But like Then he goes, but the woman, what she has to do is, perform that she's enjoying the experience. And he says, old capitalism was like being the man. How does he put it? It's like the man is objectified, the woman is like subjectified or something. And he's saying new capitalism, like service industry capital or service, sector or whatever the fuck, the thing that he's talking about where you have to perform and all this stuff. He's like, that's worse because now you're the woman. Like you have to pretend like you enjoy your job and stuff. You have to use your whole being in it. And I think he's a really good point, and I also think it's very funny because it's almost like stand up. You could just be like, 100 years ago, work was like this. That was bad. And now it's like,
it's true.
You have to own and stuff.
Those the pornographic actors, I'm sure many of them don't get much. Well, I don't know, but I would think it's like a similar thing to this. It's like it's work to have intercourse, and when you do a lot of it all the time as your job, it may not be as fun, but maybe not.
Out.
Yeah.
No, there's like a truth to to that and all like labor now, and there's like these interesting ways in which now so much of it is you have to perform. I'm hesitating because I'm trying not to use the term emotional labor because that's what everyone says when they talk about this, because it's not. It's one of those things where everyone's misusing a Marxist term, but something along those lines. Where you
I think that is where it came from, though. Originally, is having to like, hi, hey guys, how's it going? How are you today? These are specials. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, or maybe it is. I'm thinking of reproductive labor people misuse, or whatever. Or like I guess people misuse emotional labor as like just talking
listening
to
a friend. Yeah,
like anything that isn't outside of like work or whatever. People will just you abuse the shit out of that term and be like, I shouldn't have to like watch your band play. That's emotional labor. But speaking of emotional labor, I don't even know how I'm trying to make this segue work. Look, we love talking about Eric Adams. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah.
I know we talk about him every single episode of the show forever, and it's show is about much more than just Eric Adams, but goddamn, is he never stops producing the goods. He don't miss.
He's setting himself up for a media career, which he'll have to pivot to in less than a year.
He did this thing the other day where he let me read the tweet. Now Adams is wearing a new version of the shirt reading "In Dio Confidiamo," which is "In God We Trust" in Italian. So he did some press conference where he was talking about a roof collapse that happened in the Dominican Republic, and clearly he thinks that the shirt the phrase on the shirt "In Dio Confidiamo" is in Spanish. So he's saying like he's honoring the Dominican people by saying, doing the politician thing where you learn a sentence in Spanish and you're like, me gusta DR or whatever. But it's in fucking Italian.
And but it has an American flag, right?
Oh yeah, it doesn't make any fucking sense.
Yeah. Why wouldn't he do the Dominican flag? Is he trying to say the U.S. should take over the Dominican Republic, or does he have it mixed up with Puerto Rico? He thinks it's like a protectorate.
So I'm sorry, I should explain the whole story here because there's it doesn't make any more sense the more we learn about this, but it is very funny.
It just increasingly makes less and less sense. This is true of everything involving Eric Adams.
He's wearing an "In God We Trust" shirt, and he began his weekly press conference by thanking God for his federal corruption case getting dropped.
Okay. I thought you were going to say for the case. It was like, wow, this is Eric Adams' logic about to be displayed here. He's like, God gives you perseverity, and I persevere, and I'm thankful for that.
He's standing in front of a big fucking sign he printed that says like "safest subways in recorded history minus pandemic." It has to say minus pandemic at the end of like an asterisk.
You can just lie. You don't need that. Like, I bet that was his idea because he's crazy and like that was the base that he felt he needed to cover. But he lies about everything else. Why not just say like safest subways can mean anything? Like that's such a vague term.
Maybe he got a little gun shy because he got caught lying so hard. So now he's selling the whole truth or whatever. So he's got all these weird graphics in front of him. He's doing a press conference. He has "In God We Trust" in English on his shirt, and then he comes back out with "In Dio Confiamo," and he's saying it's in Spanish. So he said, "That's why today in Spanish I'm saying God we trust, because that's the time we need to lean on the faith." Because that's the time we need to lean, whatever. And I guess somebody called him out for it being in Italian, and he just said, "My heart's in the right place."
God.
So Eric Adams, you're the bozo of the week. Bringing that back.
He is. So he obviously failing at speaking Spanish or putting it on shirts. Zoran this weekend came out with a Spanish language video where he totally nails it. And I know people who are native Spanish speakers who's like, he did a better job than like a lot of Latin politicians would do. But I haven't gun authority. He doesn't actually speak Spanish. He just learned every pronunciation for every single word phonetically and just nailed the video. And hopefully it'll make a dent. He's making a push for Spanish language media in New York City, trying to get that voting bloc away from Cuomo. But he's gaining. He's in the 20s now, but Cuomo's still quite a bit ahead, unfortunately.
Oh, damn. Well, me gusta Zoran.
Did you see, speaking of Eric Adams, did you see his post yesterday for it was just a nice day post. It was a weather post, enjoy the weather post. He had a picture of himself, the mayor, talking to a dad, and the dad had a little toddler daughter. And the post was, "It's a great day out there. Get outside and bring your shorty."
Okay.
With a picture of him and a dad with his daughter.
Who said this?
Eric Adams.
Oh, okay. That's so funny, because that's not what shorty's supposed to mean.
Yeah. Well, for context, though, this happened a month or two ago. He was in Rockaway, which is it's called Far Rockaway because it's very far from everything. It's like at the end of the A train. It's kind of near some beaches in Queens. And he was giving a speech there, and he was like, "I used to have a shorty out in Rockaway." And he admitted to hopping the turnstile to visit his shorty in Rockaway, which, shorty is supposed to mean, my understanding of it was always a person you hook up with, which makes sense in that context, which makes it even more bizarre that he would try to keep the bit going by having a picture of his dad and his toddler daughter. Like, I don't know if he wrote the tweet or not, but there's something in this man where he'll take like a funny thing and then make it funnier, where he's like trying to contribute to the joke, but it just brings it into a totally new, strange direction that no one anticipates and is very uncomfortable with.
So he knows that shorty is a colloquial term for, like, you're a man, you're talking about a woman you're hooking up with, or a woman in general. I mean, it's not like that specific, but then he also said that. I mean, maybe we're being a little hard on him here, because there's also, you can say shorty about a kid, I think. Remember Shorty's Watching Shorties, the badly executed comedy show on Comedy Central way back in the day?
Okay, vaguely, but I feel like that has a different.
I want to say that was like somebody really weird by today's standards. I think it was Nick DiPaolo.
Oh my God.
Wait a minute. Who was Shorty's Watching Shorties? It was really stupid. It was like two babies that were animated, and then they were watching like stand-up clips and then commenting on them.
Well, that makes okay. I mean, I can see it being used for just like a kid, but given the context he's already used it in, and it's become kind of like a popular clip, it just it's still strange that he would continue it with a father-daughter relationship.
Yeah, it was one of the babies was Nick DiPaolo and one was Patrice O'Neal. So like,
Classic
I mean,
shorties. Okay.
you know,
When I think of shorty, that's who I want in Rockaway, who I'm topping a turnstile to come see and snuggle with.
two babies. One of them is like, freaking Black Lives Matter. And then the other one is a black baby who's like, got something really misogynist to say.
Wait, so isn't there a music video where the people become babies? Is that what it was? Like the baby vision almost? It's like you make a human a baby and they're sitting on the couch and they're talking. Why? Okay, so the bit was that they were watching what exactly?
They were two babies, and then they're cartoons of them, but they're voiced by Nick DiPaolo and Patrice O'Neal. And then they would watch like short stand-up clips. You know, there used to be a lot of like on Comedy Central, like when I was growing up, there was like Premium Blend and stuff like that. It would people had comedy specials, but then they would make these shows where they took like clips from people's stand-up sets and then made them into like a mixtape type.
Okay.
I think I don't really
understand.
Idea.
It was do with TikTok.
I guess that is what TikTok is, but like I liked stand-up when I was a kid because it was presented in this way, and it was like you got a little bit of the best highlights of everyone, and then you could like sort of go, oh, I like that person, and then when their special came on, you'd watch it, and you didn't have to like sit down and watch every 30-minute special to decide who was good. There was a golden age in like the late 90s and shit. Right before Shorty's Watching Shorties, which is 2004, which I guess is the death knell of this, but like where stand-up was easy to watch. There was a channel you would go watch it, and you would get like little samples of everyone, and you could really get a feel for what the fuck was going on. And I do stand up now. I don't know what my career is at this point, but like we're so far into the future. When people tell me they're a fan of comedy, I'm like, what is that like? Like where? Because they're not getting this. They're not even getting Shorties Watching Shorties. Like I don't know where they're getting it from. But
TikTok, Instagram.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them it's podcasts, and then they have like the weird like 1,000-yard stare, and I go, oh shit, this person's about to go off about how like this starts. When I was in Mexico, this woman just started screaming, "I'm not woke! I am not woke! I like Tom Segura!" And I was like, okay, like great. That's weird that he's the one that you like, even.
Yeah,
but sure. So I know that's part of it, but I guess TikTok is the more normal answer. That's the future. That's Premium Blend now, I guess.
Did she do a microaggression against Italians and confuse Tom Segura and Nick DiPaolo?
Maybe, and that would make a lot more sense because I'm sorry, like I know I ideologically hate all these people and stuff, and they're horrible and evil and funny to me. Some of them are fucking funny, and Tom Segura is not. That dude is boring. That guy's like a real estate developer that just does stand up because he has a lot of money. He just bought his way into like, he just bought his way into like hanging out with Joe Rogan and shit. And it's like, okay, when you watch him, you're like, okay, this is the boss is doing a set. Everyone around him has to laugh. Very not funny. I'm sorry. You're insane.
Okay. I just remember one or two jokes I liked, but that was a while ago.
You're insane. I don't know. My ass. I'm probably wrong. I'm sure he's got a couple good bits. Most people do. Anyways, I don't remember why I got on this, but Shorty's
Eric Adams stand-up special. He's rebooting Shorty's Watching Shorties, and it's going to be Eric Adams in another failed mayor. I guess
Eric Adams and Michael Rappaport.
Michael Rappaport, maybe Lori Lightfoot in the mix too. Your failed mayors and Rappaport, and they are watching TikTok clips or stand-up clips, and they're not getting the new Zoomer humor. They're just confused. They have no idea what's going on, and their commentary on it is probably funnier than a lot of comedy. Yeah,
make it. I'll watch the fuck out of it.
Well, gee, how do I pivot to this? I did an interview, and it's not comedy related, but it is a really fascinating subject. Trade. We talk about it a lot. It's in the news. It's pressing. The Trump administration is all over the place. It's hard to tell what they're doing with tariffs. But there's a history of a left-wing free trade movement. It used to be especially in the 19th century and pre-World War II, 20th century, free trade was very much a left-wing radical idea. Not just liberals. Marx himself was for free trade, and that was something I always found interesting. I knew that, but I didn't fully know the historical context. And so I talked to a historian who wrote a book in 2024. So before, the election, before he knew Trump was going to win. And that is Pax Economica is the name of the book. And I talked to the author, William Marc Palen, and in the interview, I did typically, and this is the sort of thing that probably only bothers me, and by mentioning it, now people will think about it and would not have otherwise. But in an interview, you want to start off by saying, "Thanks for coming on the show," and then they say, "Yeah, thanks for having me," and then their voice comes in. That's everyone gets to hear their voice for the first time. I forgot to do that part. I just went straight into the question, but he handled it like a pro. Again, something that almost definitely did not matter. But I want the listeners to know that I know that I did that, in case you're like, "Hey, why didn't he say thanks for coming on?" But I am thankful that he came on, because it was a great interview and a fascinating subject, and a great book.
I think it's fine that you did that. I think it's kind of like, honestly, sometimes it sounds kind of like artistic to me when the conversation just starts. I'm like, ooh, cool. Like they're already talking.
Yeah.
But I do appreciate that you hyper fixated on it, though. That's fun too.
Right. It's kind of the tariff of the mind in the interviewer. But without further ado, let's go to my interview with Professor Marc William Palen. Okay, we are now joined by Marc William Palen, who is a professor at the University of Exeter, as well as the author of Pax Economica, Left-Wing Visions of Free Trade, which is an excellent book exploring kind of a lost history. And I'm really excited to dig into that. But first, you're a historian, and if there's two things historians love, it's counterfactuals and then also being asked to comment on current events. So with that, I guess, what is your reaction over the past couple of weeks to quote unquote Liberation Day and then Trump's successive sort of sclerotic trade policy now in his second term?
I think for me, as well as just about everybody, I think people, even including people in the administration itself, were maybe caught off guard by the extreme length of the tariffs that were implemented on so-called Liberation Day. And so maybe the rollbacks on some of those isn't terribly surprising, but the drastic measures of those tariffs were something that even those expecting it at some point were not expecting it to quite that degree. For me, it wasn't terribly shocking. I think he's been quite consistent on this. One of the things he's been consistent on since the '80s is his desire to do this. I guess we can think about what it is about this second term that made it much more feasible for him to do so. But his use of claiming this is these tariff laws in the name of national security gives him a lot of extra power to unilaterally do these things, which I think is something that he really likes about it. And the ability to use these tariffs as cudgels, as a way to bully allies into coming in, perhaps begging for exemptions, and the same goes for U.S. businesses. I think there's that element too that must be a draw here. But just like the stock markets, I think we're all just not quite sure what's going to happen tomorrow, even still, right?
Yeah, the historians of the future will certainly have their work cut out for them. But your book did come out before Trump's recent election, but is now more relevant than ever, I think. Pax Economica is the name. What motivated you to write this work?
It grew out of the first book. The first book was about the fight between free trade and protectionism, and the way that kind of played out between the British and American empires in the late 19th century. And it was supposed to be the kind of the first history of the kind of modern American free trade movement, beginning in the mid 19th century, and it had quickly turned into a history of the U.S. peace and anti-imperialist movements because of the way that these ideologies intersected with left-wing politics in America. And so it was when I started looking ahead in the archives, just kind of cheating a little bit. I was supposed to stop in the 1890s. I started seeing these peace organizations that were, say, founded in Boston in the First World War period, so 1917, 1918, like the International Free Trade League. And I was looking at the officers lists, and it was just a who's who of radical women suffragists, Marxist internationalists, Christian pacifists. And so I realized there was something really fascinating happening here by the time we get to the early 20th century. At the next stage of the story, and in fact, it turns into much more of an international story. Sun Yat-sen, the provisional president of the Chinese Republic, is on that list. A variety of British and European radicals, including radicals from the newly created Soviet sphere that were being represented in these organizations. So this really broad, encompassing left-wing free trade organization dedicated to world peace was the big kind of giveaway here that there was something more to the story. And the more I started pulling on those strings backwards and forwards, the more this kind of network, this cast of characters involved in this left-wing free trade movement, and ultimately peace and anti-imperialist movement, it just kind of fell into place.
Yeah, and it's certainly interesting looking at it with a modern eye because over the course of my lifetime, free trade has been thought of as a center-right ideology. But what made it such a radical one back in the 19th and early 20th centuries?
I mean, this is, that's definitely one of the areas where I was surprised at, or maybe one of the other reasons for writing this book, even before 26. This was 2015 when I started working on this. So we're still in the Obama years. Seemingly the height of the neoliberal era was still at play, and its demise was not on my radar any more than most others, I think. But yeah, it was this left-wing story that I was starting to see unfolding in the archives about free trade advocacy, and the way that was actually starting to intersect with mid 20th century politics and recreating of a new world order after 1945 that, as you point out, is usually associated with center right or even far right economic thinkers and politicians. So you got the Frederick Hayeks, the Milton Friedmans, and then their connections with the Margaret Thatchers and the Ronald Reagans, right? So there's that literature, and it's a really rich literature that tends to associate free trade as we know it today with this kind of right-wing narrative and right-wing tradition. And this just didn't quite add up with this longer history that goes back to the mid-19th century of left-wing free trade activism. And I think to understand, though, why so many people on the left, center left to the far left, subscribe to free trade, I think we have to remind ourselves about what the world looked like to them, what it also looked like to their kind of antagonists in the story, the protectionists. So one of the things I try to emphasize in the book is when you go back actually to, say, the 19th century, free trade tended to be much more closely associated with left politics, and protectionism tended to be associated much more closely with right-wing conservative politics in ways that might not be all that surprising to us in 2025, but might have been 10 years ago, before this big shift we've been seeing happening. And what you end up also having to remind yourselves too is in at least from around 1870 to the 1930s, this is an era of a global economic nationalist order, is how I describe it. This is an era of empires, but aside from the British Empire, which sticks to free trade from the 1840s till the 1930s, every rival empire of the British, the Germans, the French, the Russians, the Americans, the Japanese by the 1900, all turned to protectionist politics, in part to thwart the perceived machinations of the British free trade empire. And so it's this protectionist economic nationalist makeup of the imperial order of the late 19th century that is key to understanding then why those who are opposed to empire, those who are opposed to this frequent trade wars that often led to military conflicts. So that's where the people on the left come into play, these peace internationalists, these anti-imperialists. If there's this close association with protectionism and imperialism and military conflict, as it was often assumed back then you would take the alternative tack, and that's the idea here that it really kind of picks up in a big way in the mid 19th century. This idea, especially for those on the left, that a different order, a free trade order, in which all countries trade freely with one another and become closely interdependent and interlocked, become more friendly over time. You can lower costs of goods. This is especially true for those who were struggling to put food on the table, right? So getting rid of tariffs on food meant people could actually no longer have a food insecurity, on top of which it had this really important kind of connection to democratization. So in the mid-19th century and most of the 19th, and we could even say maybe the 20th century. Monopolies are a big issue here. A lot of protectionist monopolies of this period that come into existence. A lot of land monopolies are also a big part of this too. So aristocratic landed elites that own the land are also the ones controlling foreign policy making. And so, and they're the ones that are making the money off of the high tariffs on, say, foreign grain. So if you can get rid of the tariffs, you can undermine the economic influence of the aristocratic militant elites. Then you can democratize foreign policy. Then you can bring down the cost for government expenditures. If you no longer have to have standing armies and navies to defend these imperial projects and these frequent wars, then you can have you can bring down the cost and taxes on the people themselves. And so for them, it was just sort of this panacea of low taxes, cheap goods, plentiful food, and of course peace and anti-imperialism as a natural byproduct from that.
Yeah, well, as you just alluded to, there's kind of this dichotomy you explore in the book between the British and I guess not just the U.S. empire, but many other Western empires, which were economic nationalists. But Britain, as you said, really retained that sort of free trade imperialism. What was the reason for that?
So they are the most industrially advanced economy in the mid-19th century. I think that certainly plays a part in this. But they are also an island nation, sorely dependent on imports. I think that's another key kind of factor here for why they do things first and differently than say the rest of the empires. So it's this, yeah. So there's this middle class grassroots campaign from what I'd call the center left in British politics to overturn these protective tariffs on foreign grain, the Corn Laws, as they were called. That were again associated so closely with this land monopolization and of course all these people are industrializing, coming to the industrial cores in Britain, but there's also a lot of poverty in these industrial towns, and so this was an easy way, it seemed, to make sure that the British people could put food on the table in a cheap bread. Mm. The cheap loaf, as it came to be known, and very famously in British politics, and so that's kind of the domestic origins of this. And then, of course, some of these leaders of this free trade movement immediately throw themselves into the abolitionist movement and the international peace movement thereafter, because, for them, they see this connection between free trade and world peace as so closely connected. Now, there are some in British politics who are free traders from this point on, who are also supporters of the British Empire. They're also more willing to use coercive force to implement free trade in certain places. And so you do have rare moments, rare areas within the British imperial context where free trade would then be forced on unwilling countries. So the Opium Wars in China are case in point in the mid-19th century. India, Ireland, these areas that are deemed to be quote unquote uncivilized and not able to have control over their own tariff policies. Have free trade forced upon them. And so this is how the British Empire operates. But I think it's important to note, though, that the people in my book were vehemently opposed to those imperial projects. Mm. So the true believers from the left, the liberal radicals in chapter 2, who overturn the Corn Laws and then throw themselves into the peace and anti-imperialist movements, they are very critical and oppositional to the Opium Wars. They're oppositional to this coercive enforcement of free trade in India and elsewhere. This is not how they envision it, right? It's supposed to be a non-interventionist, non-coercive embrace that hopefully the world would take on as they saw the benefits that Britain was gaining from it. And so I think most of the scholarship tends to focus on the liberal imperial side of that story. Mm. And I wanted to recover these important kind of marginalized voices that ended up being the biggest critics from within of the British imperial policy.
Yeah, and that's something I definitely wanted to ask you about, radical liberalism or liberal radicalism. There's kind of an epithet on the online left to call people a rad lib, or at least it was a few years ago. But really is a substantial tradition here that you describe. What is radical liberalism, and how does free trade fit into it?
Yeah, so the liberal radical tradition is, again, it is this minority current within first British liberal politics, but as I've touched on in this book and in the other one, these liberal radicals pop up in quite a few other areas around the mid-19th century. So the French get their liberal radicals, and again, they're all being influenced by the same, British free trade ideas that are kind of introduced in the 1840s in a big way. And again, this close association with the peace movements is all connected there too. So the liberal radicals are what I would call the center left of this story. They think that the capitalist system, especially once it becomes much more protectionist from 1870 onwards, doesn't have to be that way. So they think you can reform the capitalist system, make it more of a focused on trade liberalization instead of trade wars and colonial expansion. And so these liberal radicals are going to be the kind of thorn in the side of protectionist politics and politicians in the French context, in the German context, in Spanish context, the American. They really are the biggest opponents from within these empires to try to dismantle it, because this is their vision for global order and global economic reordering doesn't really allow much space for imperial projects, and so that's where the liberal radicals come. And this, of course, is going to be different from what we'd call the far left, which for many of whom you can't reform the capitalist system. That's not the end goal. The end goal ultimately would be socialist revolution. And so there's that kind of variation along the left-wing spectrum that I tease out.
Yeah, and there's a whole chapter about Marxism and socialism and how that fits into this. I think our listeners will find really interesting, because this comes up sometimes nowadays. The fact that Marx and Engels were both pro-free trade. As you write in the book, Marx said it was a progressive condition for capitalism, which could maybe be read as a reformist desire, and Engels thought free trade could hasten the destruction of the whole system, which to the modern ear sounds like accelerationism, so to speak. Is there a tension there, and what were their logics on why they were for free trade?
I mean, there's probably more, I think, common ground than there is differentiation.
Okay.
And I suppose it depends on Karl Marx and Engels writing when. That's
Sure.
important here. But I mean, if this is one of the key reasons why I start that chapter on the Marxist free trade tradition once again in the 1840s England, where this free trade movement in many ways begins. And that's because I think it's important to recognize that that's where Marx and Engels lived.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we can't take that. It's more than coincidental that Marx and Engels, who start having, I wouldn't say they're nearly as embracing of free trade ideas as their liberal radical counterparts of the era, as you point out, especially with the Engels example, right? This is a useful tool for progressing capitalism to its ultimate demise, right? So, and the socialist revolution that will come. But I think for Karl Marx and Engels, I think living in Engels lived in Manchester, England, where this was the kind of the center of all this free trade activism, the so-called Manchester School or Manchester liberalism. That's where Engels was, and then joined a little bit later by Marx himself. And lo and behold, you have Karl Marx, 2 years after the overturning of the Corn Laws, 2 years after the ushering in of British free trade policies and ideology in such a big way. You have Karl Marx giving a speech in Brussels, Belgium, on behalf of why the socialists of the world should be free traders. And it's in a very similar way to what Engels is saying, right? It's a half-hearted endorsement at the very best. It's believing that free trade, this move that the British had just initiated in 1846, seemed like the next progressive step, small p progressive step in capitalist evolution, meaning also then that protectionism was regressive.
Mm-hmm.
And so protectionism is an outmoded form that was stunting capitalist development, whereas free trade would hasten its ultimate demise. And I think it's important too that they also saw, meaning is, if you're integrating the world's markets, that means you're probably also integrating the world's workers. And so you're setting things up for that socialist revolution in useful ways too. But I think it's useful here too, where Engels and Marx actually talk about protectionism, is a lot more similarities with their liberal radical counterparts in the 1840s and 1850s, which is they also associate protectionism in kind of violence tinged terminology, and see it as this sort of screw that is meant to work against your trade enemies, but ultimately turns upon its wielder. And so in that sense, the way that they associate protectionism as something that it doesn't work for either because of the trade wars it creates, or because of the way it ultimately kind of comes back to haunt the the nation practicing it is, I think, in many ways very similar to the liberal radical critique. And so there's some striking similarities there that I think maybe people might find quite enlightening. Yeah.
Yeah. And it certainly has nationalist overtones, and that's something they were trying to overcome. There were, though, some socialists in the 19th century, and of course later, who were anti-free trade. Who were they, and what was their logic?
Yeah, and maybe we can get into how the free trade tradition continues to develop after Marx and Engels have
Yeah.
have gone away. In the next generation, it's much more, I think, even more radical free trade radicalism from the socialist side of things. But I think this is one of the as you pointed out with drawing out the nationalist element here, one of the kind of tensions that I make sure to draw here too is that not all socialists think the same.
Yeah.
And indeed, if you go to the long history of 19th century socialism and heck, even 20th century socialism, there are right-wing socialists, right? So it wasn't just assuming you're socialist, you're on the left. There were quite a few socialists who were on the right. They tended to be nationalistic, socialism for one country, very anti-immigration. Jobs should be for the workers of, say, France, not for immigrants. And so there's this right-wing socialist nationalist tradition that tends to fall into the protectionist camp in very understandable ways, right? Economic nationalism, political nationalism, and defending of the imperial projects. And so that was at first surprising, but when it kept happening over and over, looking at these socialist nationalist actors and organizations in various contexts, and the way that they so often would become supportive of their imperial governments in those imperial enterprises was a striking juxtaposition to the socialist internationalists started by Marx and Engels tradition that is vehemently critical of these imperial projects and of the protectionist policies that they think are creating them. And then of course, once we get to the late 1890s, you've got the British Labour Party founded, you've got the Social Democratic Party in Germany, these workers' parties that are, they're free trade parties. And this is how I think we have to, it's really interesting to see how that comes into being, that some of the most important turn of the century socialist political parties are free trade parties. And I think you can't understand that without understanding this forgotten left-wing tradition. And indeed, like in the case of the Social Democratic Party, you've got Edvard Bernstein, Karl Kautsky, Bebel, essentially the next generation of socialist thinkers, intellectuals, kind of take the mantle from Marx and Engels in certain senses. They're hardcore free traders. In fact, Edvard Bernstein's own biographer describes him as more Manchester liberal than Marxist because of his adherence to free trade. And what's interesting too is that once you look at the Marxist political parties that subscribe to these free trade ideas, they actually kind of dropped the whole half-hearted endorsement of Marx and Engels. For Marx and Engels, again, it was just supposed to get you closer to the socialist revolution. What was fascinating is when you start looking at the early 20th century socialist internationalists and their support for free trade, that connection between free trade and socialist revolution is gone. It's purely about free trade as a more peaceful and less aggressive form of trade that they're endorsing along much more of the liberal radical line than the socialist line that Marx and Engels laid out.
Right. And in the background too, you also have the feminist movement, which you dedicate a whole chapter to, which was very free trade. Why was that so important to the suffragism and feminism?
Yeah, I did not expect that to be one of the chapters either. A lot of these came as surprises to me, but I had to, I just went where the archives were, and I guess I had an inkling of that when I saw those women suffragists in that free trade organization I mentioned at the beginning here in the First World War era Boston, dedicated to peace. But so this also again traces back to the 1830s and 1840s. And these emancipatory movements that were becoming so prevalent, especially within Anglo-American networks. And that is the close association between this left-wing liberal radical free trade movement and abolitionism, which was also very close at this time. So there's some, especially on the farthest left, that were involved within the abolitionist movement, who were also involved in the free trade movement, were also supportive of not just manhood suffrage, but also universal suffrage. So people like William Lloyd Garrison, who's this kind of arch abolitionist of the United States from Boston, and he's got his Liberator newspaper that was espousing his radical abolitionist ideas. He was one of the earliest subscribers to these British-born free trade ideas in the United States. And he's also very supportive of getting women actively involved with the abolitionist movement against the wishes of others within the broader transatlantic anti-slavery movement, who weren't really okay with granting women that much autonomy within these movements. So anyways, there's this connection between freeing men, freeing trade, and democratization, which kind of came up a bit already with democratization of foreign policy. If they believe that free trade allows for greater democratization, then that also means it's going to allow for maybe the allowance of greater involvement of women in politics. And then once you get to the First World War, this kind of suffragist connection to free trade becomes much more pronounced. And that is during the First World War, where you have the creation of the International Women's Peace Movement that takes root to a certain extent in New York and Boston, and then switches over to Germany, to Geneva after the First World War. But it's this International Women's Peace Movement that's dedicated to free trade ideas along these liberal radical or Marxist internationalist lines that takes hold. And I think for one of the reasons why they are so adamant, and maybe slightly different from their male counterparts by the time of the First World War, is because of what they see from war. And that is, of course, war itself is something that they're opposed to and have no real control over, because they don't have political power at this point. They don't have the right to vote, and so they're kind of helpless victims in many ways of war, and so are children. And so this is one of the things that comes through is, of course, during wartime itself, it's women and children who suffer the most, despite not having any way to influence said wars. Or keep them from happening. And then once you get to the years immediately after the First World War, these women's peace organizations, they go on these humanitarian missions to, say, Eastern Europe, and they find just this mass starvation. So that you've got, say, in Eastern Europe in the early 1920s, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was no longer around. The Ottoman Empire was no longer around. So you have all these newly independent states in Eastern Europe. But when these women's peace activists go on these humanitarian missions, they find mass starvation. They find women and children starving everywhere, years after the First World War had ended. And their diagnosis is hypernationalism, that these newly independent states took all the wrong lessons from the more developed imperial counterparts of the era and had embraced protectionism. They were levying tariffs against each other. And so they weren't trading freely in basic foodstuffs that would have allowed for access to cheap food and ending of the kind of food insecurity of the era. And so for these feminists involved in the peace movement, for them, creating a free trade order became something even more than just creating a more peaceful order. It was very closely associated to them as what they saw themselves as the mothers of the world. Of this is going to help us to make sure that the women and children of the world no longer feel the worst effects of war, and no longer hopefully have to feel hunger pains.
And around this time, you also have, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917. I know something related to this that you've written about is Lenin's theory of imperialism. How does free trade fit into his theory there?
Yeah, that was a surprise to me too, because I think it'll make sense, but it's in many ways, if you really dig into Lenin's theory of imperialism, he's repudiating Marx and Engels' earlier position, where Marx and Engels are saying that free trade is the next small p progressive step in capitalist development. That's how they understood what was happening in that moment. But you jump forward to the First World War when Lenin is writing his key tract on this, and he's looking back on the previous decades, especially that protectionist turn that I mentioned from around 1870. And he sees this very close connection between this protectionist turn around 1870, the long depression that sets in 1873, and colonial expansion and the growth of monopolies as all connected. So for him, this was a inevitable progression from a freer trade system of the mid-19th century to this protectionist, monopolist, and colonialist order that comes into being, say, the scramble for Africa and the divvying up of China by the late 19th century. Spanish-American War, the Boer Wars, right? There's all these different wars and conflicts that you can point to, that Lenin's pointing to say, this is all connected. But for him, it's this natural aggression to protectionism, but it's his association of protectionist policies with monopolies, with business and financial monopolies, and the inefficiencies, the market inefficiencies that protectionism creates as a result of these monopolies, that leads to the need for these imperial powers to go out and search for new markets, to export surplus capital, to export surplus populations, to exploit raw materials. So for him, if you really dig into Lenin's theory, it's his association with protectionism and the imperial expansion of that era that ultimately culminates in the First World War. Once they divvy up all the land of the world, they finally have to turn on each other. And so there's a really fascinating direct connection between trade, in this case protectionism, and Lenin's critique of the outbreak of the First World War.
Yeah, it's interesting how, like many debates on Marxism, they continue long after his death. But there are these two schools that come through in the book, and that's the Marx Manchester school and the Marx List tradition. What's the difference between these two schools of thought?
Yeah, well, briefly, Friedrich List is, I think he's getting his moment again, as far as people are paying attention to his influence again. But for a long time, I think he was marginalized. He's this German-American political theorist who is working within and writing at the same time as these liberal radicals are doing something very different in Britain. He's arguing for infant industrial protectionism for Germany, for the United States. He's very clear about what this infant industrial protectionist policy is supposed to be used for, and it's supposed to be used for Britain's imperial rivals to catch up and overtake the more industrially advanced British. But he writes this book in 1841 called The National System of Political Economy that essentially becomes the secular Bible for industrialists and nationalists across the globe, including within most of Britain's imperial rivals' centers of power. And it's this connection too that is this Listian ideology of protectionism and imperial expansion that he enunciates that does actually find a welcome home within those socialist nationalists that we talked about earlier, right? So you've got the socialist internationalist tradition that becomes more and more close to free trade as we get into the early 20th century. And then you have that socialist nationalist tradition that becomes much more closely aligned with this Listian economic nationalist tradition that often comes closely associated with the defense of imperial expansion. And so this is the tension that you're going to have. So you're going to have socialist nationalist organizations, this Marxist tradition that are often going to be at odds with the Marx Manchester tradition of free trade, even within their own nations. And in fact, you go back, I mentioned that Karl Marx was extremely critical of protectionism, but some of his most scathing indictments were against none other than Friedrich List. So there's a really strong and very long rant that Marx does against List and his perceived influence on German politics. And so there is this really interesting tension between the economic nationalist tradition within socialism and the free trade tradition. And I think, I don't know about people listening, but for me at least, I when I first came at this, I often associated Marxism and socialism with economic nationalism as sort of, kind of naively thinking that capitalism equated to free markets.
Mm-hmm.
And not realizing that there's a whole lot of varieties of capitalism, and in the context of the late 19th century, it's mostly economic nationalist forms of capitalism that we're dealing with, but associating Marxism in the case of the Soviet sphere as some sort of socialism for one country, autarky, which also is not terribly accurate. There's some great work being done on this too that's showing that there's a lot more nuance to this story than that. But that was how I approached this. So to kind of tease out this alternate Marxist tradition of free trade was a really useful kind of a counter to this economic national story that at least I that's how I understood it before digging into this.
And you mentioned the socialism in one country, which starts to come of age, I guess, in the 20th century. Is there an extent to which some pro-free trade socialists maybe underestimated the need for third world countries to implement economic nationalism once they won independence?
I think, yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on the time.
Okay.
So part of this story is generations, and one of the things that comes through is each generation that succeeds the next one is more radical around these ideas.
Mhm.
So I think that would be a fair description for, say, Bernstein or Kautsky. They probably would have very little sympathy in the 19 teens, or turn of the century for what we would now call third world or global south or decolonial calls for protectionism, because they had little space for that in that particular moment. But one of the things I found that was really striking in that last chapter, when I dig into the post 1945 period, when you do have the decolonizing world start coalescing around it, well, I actually think it's a really interesting kind of amalgamation of both of these strands. That I think that the Marxist internationalists, the women's peace movement, even many of the liberal radicals that still are on the kind of left wing of politics in the Cold War, um, become much more open to the idea that these decolonizing states who have had decades, even centuries of exploitation, who have had imperial powers undermining their ability to industrialize, realizing that they need time to catch up. So allowing for kind of at least short-term protectionist policies to allow for these decolonizing states to start to catch up industrially. But what's fascinating about all that too is how these decolonizing states also use the politics of free trade in really remarkable ways after 1945.
Mm.
So um, the idea here is that once you dig into what Kwame Nkrumah famously termed neo-colonialism, I think for many, we think Western neocolonialism after 1945, it must have been what we call free trade imperialism from the West against the rest. But what's really fascinating when you dig into a lot of the debates in, say, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in 1964, which is sort of the first kind of giving airance to these grievances at a big way from the decolonizing world, their critiques of Western neocolonialism are very much in keeping with the older left-wing tradition of free trade. They're saying what the West is doing is they're subsidizing their agriculture, their manufacturers. They're making it impossible for these newly independent states to export their, say, raw materials into these Western markets, because these Western powers are still secretly, tacitly practicing economic nationalism in a way that was detrimental to these newly independent states from trading in the world economy. So they called for the West to practice what it preached and open its markets. And I think that's been lost. And of course, the embargo against Cuba that the United
Mhm.
States implements in 1962, which for reasons, if anybody can explain to me why that still exists in 2025, I'd love to hear it. But this, I think, in many ways, the Cuban embargo becomes emblematic of this continuation of this imperialism of economic nationalism that had been so prominent in the late 19th, 20th centuries, that's supposed to have gone away by the 1940s, 1950s. That was, here we are in 1962, and Cuba is being cut off from the West by the United States itself, the so-called free trade leader of this period. And this is what the decolonizing world is most concerned with. So it's a really interesting sort of adaptation of this anti-imperialism free trade that's being embraced by the decolonizing world that I think is a really fascinating connection there.
Yeah, well, one of my favorite parts in the book was the small section about Norman Thomas, who was running for president in the Roosevelt era, calling for free trade. He had and this is something that the left grapples with today, is like, what kind of system do we want on the global scale for trade and economics and development? What kind of vision was he articulating?
It was I mean, in many ways, he's illustrative of this remarkable alliance that's forming by the time of the First World War, that you can see in these peace organizations that I look at, of liberal, radical, center left activists working alongside socialist internationalists like Norman Thomas, like Scott Nearing, like Crystal Eastman, who founds this magazine in the 19 teens in the United States called The Liberator. So it's an homage to this abolitionist movement of the mid 19th century, but The Liberator here, of course, in reference to the socialist movement in the United States and beyond. And again, very hardcore free trade advocacy that you find within the Liberator magazine. And so Norman Thomas is a part of this. So as this kind of multi-time nominee for president of the Socialist Party of America, he enunciates, and he's pretty obvious, he's pretty open about this. It's a combination of his embrace of Manchester liberal free trade ideas from the liberal radicals, and of course the socialist free trade tradition that he's drawing on here, and he's I think he's quite aware of both of these traditions, and is quite cognizant of it. And of course he is a moderate socialist, you know, willing to work within the U.S. and international system to reform it into something more conducive for the socialist project in the United States and abroad. But it's also his close association, condemnation of Republican protectionist politics. Of course, the Republican Party, the party of protectionism from its founding until well into the 20th century, maybe even up until, to a certain extent, the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s. So Norman Thomas's critiques of the Smoot-Hawley tariff are just quite in line with the liberal radical critiques of that era too, connecting it with the trade wars, the shrinking of world trade, the deepening of the Great Depression, laying ultimately the groundwork for the Second World War from this perspective that Scott Nearing also gets on board with. So yeah, he is in many ways emblematic of this kind of symbiosis of liberal radical center left ideas of free trade and peace that are commingling with the socialist internationalist dimensions of this too.
Yeah, and one of his big complaints about the Roosevelt administration was he was asked, like, aren't you glad that they're carrying out your ideas? And Norman Thomas would say they are carrying them out on a stretcher. They're not going far enough. But it did seem free trade was embraced by Roosevelt. His Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, is a really important figure in the book. What was his role, and what impact did he have on the global trade system?
Yeah, the longest serving Secretary of State in U.S. history, so 1933 to 44. You know, this is where, you know, after, you know, from 1861 until 1933. The United States is on a firm protectionist footing because of the dominance of Republicans over American trade policy during this period. And so when FDR comes in to power and he appoints this guy Secretary of State Cordell, I don't know if he knew the ramifications of that appointment or not. This is definitely, trade liberalization was much more of Cordell Hull's baby than it was FDR's. FDR just happened to be sort of amenable to it once it finally came across his desk. So this is really Hull's initiative in many ways, Hull's tariff revolution, as one economic historian described it. Of course, Cordell Hull's nickname, one of his nicknames was the Tennessee Cobden, which would mean nothing to us if we didn't understand this longer connection to the British 19th century free trade movement, Richard Cobden being the leader of the Anti-Corn Law League.
Yeah.
So Manchester liberalism and Manchester Square are often also called Cobdenism, well into the 20th century. And so this Cobdenite connection with Cordell Hull is very explicit, and he kind of comes of age in the late 19th century amidst these kind of debates over free trade and protectionism in the United States. And then it's his observations during the First World War that really solidify his understanding that, and weirdly, it's kind of like how Lenin is connecting it, economic nationalism laying the economic foundations, geopolitical tensions that culminated in the outbreak of the First World War. For Hull, he really takes this to heart. And so for him, freeing American and world trade is not just about opening markets for American manufacturers or cheap goods for American consumers. It is very much about creating a more peaceful world order, something different from what had come into being before the First World War, something different that came in after the First World War, even more extreme economic nationalism that came into being in the 1920s and 30s. So Hull wants to try to finally do something different, and he thinks he can do it through liberalizing American trade, which he starts to do in a big way in the 1930s, with the support of people like Norman Thomas and the Socialist Party of America. As well as Christian pacifists. The feminist peace movement is instrumental in all this. And of course, he lays the groundwork for the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1947, which is a massive kind of multilateral trade liberalization initiative that signatories signing on all have to cut their tariffs in a big way. And so the United States leads the way with that. This becomes the WTO in 1995. He's also, Hull's other nickname is the father of the United Nations, because he wants the League of Nations seems to have failed to maintain order and peace in the 1920s and 30s, and so he really wants to make sure that some sort of new supranational structure that can actually hopefully enforce peace and enforce to a certain extent free trade because of the seemingly natural predilections of nations to turn inwards, especially during times of economic crisis, and thus turn towards self-sufficiency and protectionism. How do we curtail that tendency in order to maintain a peaceful and prosperous world? Is a big part of what Hull does, and of course, like I said, he does so through with the support of these grassroots left-wing free trade organizations and activists. The Young Women's Christian Association becomes really big here by this time in fascinating ways too. That just blew my mind when I discovered it. And, yeah. So again, a very left-wing origin story for the post-1945 multilateral institutions, instead of that right-wing narrative that I think we tend to get from most of this scholarship.
Well, I guess I was going to ask, is that where it comes from, the idea that the post-World War II trade system is the design of globalist, leftist, communist feminists?
Yeah, weirdly enough, they might have been actually onto something more than they realized. Well, I guess it depends. Here it does depend on the time and place, right? So I think the left-wing free traders that I'm looking at here, who are working very, very closely with the U.S. State Department at this point, they have a direct line with Cordell Hull and his immediate successors. And so up until the late 1940s, at least, there is sort of a left-wing version of this Pax Economica coming into existence with the GATT, with the United Nations institutions, with the Bretton Woods institutions. And they have some degree of influence over those decisions. And so I think one of the things I speculate more than I'm able to kind of, I think just more work needs to be done here, maybe partly with archival access and when it becomes available. But at what point do these institutions start becoming less open to these left-wing free traders? I think the Cold War is a big part of that story. So when the Cold War sets in 1950, there's a hardening of these ideologies. Whatever ideas of a global free trading system that these left-wing activists and Cordell Hull had kind of come to a screeching halt with the Cold War, the Manichaean divide that both the United States and the West deserve due responsibility for creating, as well as the socialist East, the halving of world trade in many ways. But it also hardens, I think, a lot of people who might have been on the center left, who might have been willing to work with their Marxist internationalist free trade allies for many decades, now found themselves moving further to the right. You can see this especially within the Christian free trade movement. And at some point, too, organizations like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which becomes the WTO, at some point they become much more influenced by U.S. multinational corporations than they are by these grassroots organizations that helped bring it to existence in the 1940s. And that's where I think that the free trade movement, the left-wing free trade movement, starts looking. I think the timing is more than coincidental that, say, the fair trade movement comes into existence in 1968 with the Haslemere Declaration in Oxford, England. It's a very anti-colonial, pro-free trade, but it's an ethical free trade scheme that they're envisioning here, where the West pays more for products from the rest, as long as that's making sure that it's not using exploited labor, and maybe even environmental practices are being kept. And so there's these alternative left-wing grassroots movements that start kicking up just at around the same time. I argue that these institutions that came into being in the 1940s are being overtaken by right-wing intellectuals, economists, and multinational corporations, and in ways that I think maybe a lot of the listeners might associate the critiques of the free trade system of the 90s, early 2000s, the Seattle riots, protests, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, right. By the end of the 20th century, it's the left is against institutions like the WTO and are tarred as anti-globalization, which is a maddening accusation when you understand this history.
Yeah, absolutely.
But quick question as we're rounding out, can you explain the anti-colonial history of the duty-free shop?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we didn't get to Monopoly, the board game Monopoly, either, did we?
Oh, right. Yes.
Yeah, the Henry George story that is so important to this is once we get into the early 20th century, and the origins of Monopoly. But no, the duty free one, yes, since it is, I think that is how I get to in the end of the book as well. This is, I argue that the duty free shops they owe their start to this left wing free trade tradition, the anti-imperialism of free trade, anti-colonialism of free trade in this context. And so this was started by a guy named a peace activist and radical in Ireland called Brendan O'Regan.
Mm.
And he was working at a place called Shannon Airport in the 1950s. And it turns out Shannon, we don't really think about Shannon Airport very much anymore as a hub, but back then, Shannon was, I guess, about as far west in Europe as you can get. And it was really tough for planes to make the transatlantic voyage from, say, New York City to Europe. And so it was pretty much, you were guaranteed to make it to Shannon Airport with however much fuel you had. So Shannon Airport became sort of this mecca of wealthy people traveling to and from Europe in the mid 20th century. And Brendan O'Regan realizes, hey, what if we sold Irish products tax-free? Couldn't this potentially spark Irish industrialization by creating a global demand for, say, Irish whiskey? And lo and behold, it works. And so for him, this is an industrialization project, but he sees this industrialization project as an anti-colonial project, because this is to make up for the decades of having British economic policies forced upon it and stunting in Irish industrialization. So this is in many ways a free trade call for industrialization along anti-colonial lines. And it's so successful in his rollout in the 1950s that by the time you get to the 1970s, the United Nations is actually sending anti-colonial nationalist people from the developing world to go learn how to implement the duty-free shops in their own countries for similar kind of sparks of industrialization. And so, yeah, the duty-free shops that we walk through and get hit with that perfume, it actually is, however much we might have forgotten, it's I think a remnant of this left-wing free trade tradition.
Well, yeah, our listeners go out, buy some Irish whiskey and the board game Monopoly. Hopefully they sell it at some duty-free shops. Yeah, of course, a really fascinating history of that game, founded by Lizzie McGee, who was a progressive feminist. And there's a movie that came about it, or a PBS documentary recently. But last question. So for a lot of people on the left, such as myself, I think there's been an attitude of tariffs there's been a conflation, right, between the WTO, NAFTA, et cetera, and lowering tariffs, which isn't necessarily what they're about or their major function. But my attitude has been kind of up until recently is like a tariff here and there. That's not a bad thing. The economist Ha-Joon Chang has sort of explored their use in progressive economics. Should the left, in your opinion, today embrace the use of tariffs in limited capacity, or should we maintain a vision of a sort of a tariff-free world? Because one of the things that occurred to me when you were describing the 19th century is the environment and climate change was not necessarily as big of a consideration for progressives and socialists who wanted to globalize manufacturing. And now that we're living with the consequences of not just that, but a lot of other industrial machinations that have produced this so much carbon. So what do you say to the contemporary left? Should we go back to embracing free trade?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I usually like to keep myself in the historical path. Like, how would my left wingers respond to this, right? And I mean, well, one of the fascinating things about that, well, if we do bring in the environment, though, right? Like, slapping tariffs on electronic vehicles from China or solar panels from China because they're made cheaply and they're undermining, the development. I mean, you could make the case that maybe temporary protectionism there will kind of incentivize the development of cheaper and cheaper green products like this in home countries. And, maybe there's something to that, but it's hard for me to think how, from a consumer's perspective who's worried about the environment, it seems to me the sooner that we can all get access to cheap electric cars and solar panels, the better. And so it's fascinating to see how. So I think maybe too, just tapping into that the kind of the last generation of left-wing free traders that I get into, I think it's important to keep in mind that they did have a soft spot. They did have a sympathy for the decolonizing world's desires to have protectionism, at least in the short term, to give them a little bit of a kickstart, at least. And so I think in that sense, the idea that the United States needs to have a new tariff regime, it seemed out of place throughout the 20th century, and it seems out of place now. But does that necessarily mean that it's out of place for every part of the world? I'm not so sure about that. Heck, there could, there's some countries might even have, they might be too poor to have enough money revenue that they can derive from direct taxation through an income tax, and so they'll need to rely on indirect taxation like tariffs to maintain government expenditures, right? So I think there's plenty of space for why tariffs could be needed and could be even useful in certain contexts. I really struggle to see how it does so for, say, the United States at this point.
Well, that's a good note to end on. Marc William Palen, thank you for joining me. Where can people find you and your work?
Yeah, you can find me my blog, the Imperial Global Forum, or if you want, just have a look at Pax Economica and see what you think for yourself about this left wing free trade tradition, and maybe what it means for you individually, for how to understand this tumultuous period of this new economic order that we're seeing coming to being as we speak. Right.
All right. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
And that was my discussion with Marc William Palen. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. At Anders Lee here on social media. Check out The Vanquished, my other podcast. We have a full episode up about Cory Booker, which we did kind of an addendum to on our Patreon and The Vanquished Patreon. Jake was on with Fred, and we talked about Cory Booker's war against the Newark school system, public schools there, which is actually really fascinating how it was kind of a distillation of the broader charter school movement and its failure in America. And then, of course, paid protest. The next one is May 2nd. Me, Fred, and Sharif Hassan host that every first Friday, and we're raising money for a citywide tenant assembly, which is organized as part of NYCDSA's Independent Working Class Organizing Campaign. We got a lot of funny comics on the show. Ashlyn Salzano, Bassam Shaw, and a friend of the show, Andrew Durso. So you don't want to miss that one. We'll put a ticket link in the show description.
I don't really have any plugs except for the main general one. Happy Easter, everyone. If you enjoy guys with long hair who died for your sins. I'm saying I'm like Jesus. What I'm saying is
Jesus.
Yeah, this is not going anywhere. Hey, support our show. That's what I'm saying. Sign up for our Patreon if you enjoy the show. We do bonus episodes like we just talked about. I had a really good time on the Cory Booker episode trashing a beloved television show, and you can only find out which one it is by signing up for our Patreon, where you can also talk to us on Discord and stuff. That's it. That's just my annual Patreon plug, or my episode deal Patreon plug. My plug other than that is have a wonderful 420 and spring and all that stuff.
Put a nug in the Easter egg. It's not too late.
Ooh, yeah. And hey, those Easter eggs, those gotta be expensive, right? Topical humor. Ooh. I saw this clip of John Waters saying he despises the Easter Bunny today. That was pretty cool.
Really?
Yeah, he hates him.
Why?
He says that he's like these kids, they make them rummage through the brush for what? For hard-boiled eggs,
Well, if that was true, then I would hate it. But that does not happen. I don't think anyone has ever done that. If they did, they should be jailed. Hard-boiled eggs are disgusting. It's my least favorite food.
What do you mean? That's what an Easter egg is.
No, it's not. It's a plastic thing you put candy in.
Have you never had a real Easter egg?
I didn't know this was a thing. For me, it's always been, sometimes you do a Cadbury egg, but it's a plastic egg that you put. Sometimes you do in New Jersey. I saw today someone did gabagool in the egg, but you put a treat in a not real egg. Is that not the case?
You're wrong about this one. This is crazy. I don't know if this is regional or what, but no, it's a very common Easter thing. You hard boil eggs and then you use fucking egg dye and you dye them weird colors.
Oh,
you use paws, and there's an old Patton Oswalt bit about how the pause guy has a monopoly on pause.
Now I do remember this, but you don't
millennial pause.
the way we did this, we didn't hide those ones. We put those out as like, look what we did. With the things you hide are the plastic ones. No,
You can hide any egg, but now that you mention it, hiding the food ones is like a
that's
terrible idea.
insane. Yeah,
Because then if you miss one, you just have a rotting egg in your house.
this must be a Baltimore thing. That makes sense that they would do it just in an incredibly strange and wrong way in Baltimore.
It's not a Baltimore thing. We did it in Texas.
You did. It's the Baltimore Texas connection. You have that one thing in common.
No, this is just a thing that you just missed.
I mean, well, when you say it, I remember the painting, but I don't. We did not hide the painted eggs. We did the plastic ones.
Well, maybe that's what caused autism. Did you see RFK saying that you don't have to pay taxes, Anders?
Yep, that's good news because filed an extension this year. So, just Xerox that over to them. Yeah, maybe it's Easter eggs. Maybe it's the plastic. Maybe it's hard-boiled eggs. That would actually be great if we could get rid of those.
Because you hate them.
Yes.
Okay. Well, anyways, thanks for listening to the show, everyone. We all learned something new just now. It's finished. It's risen. It's whatever.
risen.
It's risen. Okay, I'm done. Blah.